Welcome everybody. Thank you for organizing this and letting us give this presentation for this seminar and this webinar. So we're going to talk about intelligent plant data linkage, and we're going to do it from the point of view that's probably less familiar to many of the listeners of the history, philosophy, and social studies of science, which is a whole field which is considering what is going on in science in general, and particularly the practices used currently to share data, distribute data, and reuse data around the world, in focusing, of course, on the case of plant science and crop science. So to start, I wanted to give a broader introduction to how we're conceptualizing, how we're seeing the landscape of plant and crop science at the moment, and what are the kind of discussions that are happening within our field. First of all, we have been focusing on the move of lab research or plant science that is being traditionally carried out in the lab in experimental environments into species of research which are more hybrid. Things like field stations, so-called farm platforms, smart glasshouses. The idea being that we're trying to integrate more and more what used to be basic plant science with translational research and agronomic research. And this obviously is one of the emphasis here is to try and capture features of the natural environment via new sensing technologies and technologies that produce big data and allow to model and analyze them. And this fusion of agronomic research with plant science is also meant to harness the insights that we have gained over the last 50 years or so into molecular mechanisms that explain some of the features, the structures and behaviors of plants so as to increase food production. Now, this integration between agronomic research and plant science also means that at the moment we have many different lines of research which have actually independently developed fairly independently over the last 40 to 50 years, who are now starting to intersect and need to find new ways to talk to each other. And this particularly is important when it comes to ideas about open data and more generally, what does it mean to do open science in research? This is an idea that has been very well grounded in research on model organisms, for instance, research on Arabidopsis thaliana, which is the key plant model for molecular plant science, but has been less obvious in terms of how to implement it and who will be the stakeholders be involved in agronomy. And so there is a constant movement towards trying to bring this kind of culture of information exchange in the different parts of plant and crop science as currently conceived. We're also looking at much more interest in the global north in what have traditionally been seen as global south crops, so crops that actually have been mostly consumed in the south of the world, such as, for instance, cassava, non-Cavendish species of banana, Bambara groundnut, yam, and so on and so forth. And also there is a very strong emphasis on trying to understand from very different perspectives gene-environment interactions. And this is particularly because it's now crucial for us to understand what phenotypic traits are involved in a response to environmental stressors, and also to understand the potential impact on genetically modified or gene-edited plants. And of course, this kind of research is rationalized as a quest for food security, particularly in situations of climate change and shifts in the weather. So all of this is then resulting in the production of global or differently local infrastructures and various venues when data materials such as germplasm and types of knowledge about plant sciences and plant species that are used around the world can be shared and discussed. And this is, of course, the key issue that I want to focus on today. Of course, it's important to signal from the beginning that this is a space where there is a very strong presence of corporate agribusiness that actually controls a lot of the innovation and research done in this area, and has been very actively involved in many of the projects around plant dissemination, sometimes even kind of seeding some of them. It's less clear at this point how much of the data held by these corporations is in fact being made open, and how. Of course, there's a lot of work in making this possible, but this is a space where we're basically just seeing part of the picture at this point. So what does it mean to circulate data about plants in the age of big and open data? Well, certainly there is a very strong focus on naming traits and doing so in a way that actually is comprehensible to many different stakeholders across cultures, across locations, and across disciplinary expertise. And of course, a strong emphasis on making these traits amenable to large-scale computational analysis, first of all, by quantifying them in a variety of different ways, many of them highly innovative, but also trying to find suitable labels for data clusters. And in that sense, the work that has been happening, for instance, on plant descriptors by Biodiversity and the FAO has been absolutely foundational and leading in this field. Now, what do we mean by integrating data here? And why do we talk about linkage rather than simply pointing to unifying all the data? Well, it's because I think rightly, many organizations have felt that it's actually not really possible to centralize data collection and data sharing. It's not really possible to bring all the data in this field together as a single body of evidence, not only because realistically this is not feasible because there's too many people involved around the globe, but also because the diversity of the communities involved in producing data and analyzing data in this space is really precious and needs to be preserved and protected. So the solution is to go towards linking and federating different data sets so that they can be consulted and linked to each other reliably and efficiently. So the imperatives here are, first of all, to think about how to make these databases interoperable. How does one facilitate inter-dataset searches through relevant algorithms, relevant infrastructures, and classification systems that can be used across the globe? Also, of course, there are big questions around how does one visualize the data, and how do different types of visualization facilitate access to conceptual, material, and social elements that enable then the mining of data, the modeling of data, and ultimately their reuse. And of course, ultimately, this is all about making data comparable. And in fact, making sure that there is enough compatibility in the idea of the minimal units, if you want, among formats and sources of data and of metadata to enable meaningful comparison. Now, what are the requirements to make plant data travel in these ways? Well, in some of our work, of course, we focus on technical challenges to make data machine readable and interoperable. But what we are really interested in is the intersection of these technical challenges with challenges which have really to do with how do we even understand knowing and knowledge, which we're calling epistemic challenges, and also challenges which are social and political about how do we actually obtain this system, how do we make it fair, and how do we make it accessible around the globe. So one first ingredient or one first requirement for this is to try and make traits available to large-scale computational analysis via suitable labels. And of course, trait descriptors are extremely important in this space. Secondly, you want to bring together data on many different types of phenomena, on gene-environment interactions, on ecological stressors, on pathogens, on different ways of thinking about biodiversity. And in order to do this, you need to not only focus on data, but also on appropriate metadata, information about the data, that can actually inform the analysis of the data and the ways in which we contextualize that data. We also want to bring together data from many different sources, genomic and experimental data by publicly funded or corporate R&D, knowledge of strains and environments by farmers and breeders around the world, and of course, the storage of relevant materials such as germplasm. In order to do that, a very, very important requirement for making plant data travel is also to be able to broker agreements for data sharing, for data access, and for data reuse among the very different stakeholders which are involved in this space. And I should have said, sorry, at the beginning, that we're very happy to take questions at the end of the presentation, but for now, we're just going to carry on so that you get a sense of what our work is like. So one of the key obstacles I want to focus on a little bit is this idea of actually trying to identify who are relevant stakeholders for this space. And the Research Data Alliance group devoted to agrosemantics, working with the FAO and many, many different other partners involved in this space, has done wonderful work in the last decades in trying to expand people's perceptions about who actually are relevant stakeholders here. So here you see in this slide an example from one of the results from this working group from 2017, when they were looking at the different stakeholders involved in sharing data about rice. And they involved not just biologists and breeders and farmers and information managers, but also nutritionists, chefs, consumers, food manufacturers, traders, and sociologists, thus expanding the space ever more. And of course, beyond these stakeholders, one also has to consider how seeds and how information about plants is used by governmental agencies and is distributed by governmental agencies. How agricultural industry, and particularly the industry that produces agricultural machinery, is picking up on these standards and these ways of sharing knowledge. How trade boards are interpreting this, and how, for instance, crop insurance companies are picking up on some of these movements. So the space of relevant stakeholders here is ever expanding, and it's a very delicate space to keep trying and negotiate. So one of the big obstacles in negotiating all of these different relationships between this very broad stakeholder space is the fact that very often there is no clear framework, or confusing at least framework, for intellectual property and legal and regulatory questions around what we may call, in a general sense, data work, which includes anything to do not just with the production of data, but with their processing, their management, and their reuse. There are, in fact, few agreements, and typically at the more local level, around the goals, the rewards, the responsibilities, and the rights that relate to the generation of digital plant data, their circulation, and their use. Also, there continues to be an unclear relation between the storing and the dissemination of germplasm and what happens to digital data that applies to that germplasm. This is particularly difficult because data, of course, have very many different types of value attached to them. It can be affective, it can be cultural, it can be political. Very often, of course, it's financial and commercial. And obviously, for our discussion here, there is scientific value. And sometimes these different types of value actually come into conflict with each other. So for instance, think about the very simple idea of producing data. Now, when we think about that, how do we really define data production? Is that the result of growing the plant specimens on which data are actually collected? Is it the result of selecting the strains? Is it the result of designing field trials, which actually can be described as a way of designing the way in which data will be collected and even deciding what data should matter? Is it a question of which measurement tools are being devised and which measurement tools have been adopted? Or is it a question around designing data storage for this data? How we answer this question, and there's no real clear-cut answer to this question, in fact, determines who is viewed as a legitimate owner of the data, and very often determines who has control over their use. And yet, all of these activities in different ways contribute to data production and have a legitimate claim, therefore, to being part of data production. So because of this very fragmented and very confusing landscape, there is an opening for a space and a potential for, in fact, new forms of exploitation and new forms of inequity. So many people in this field are worrying about the fact that actually harnessing digital data without due recognition to the work that actually underpins the production and the management of this data constitutes, in fact, a new form of bioprospecting. And some people have even pointed to what they're calling a new digital feudalism. So the potential that actually there is exploitation of communities that produce the data versus the ones that have the opportunity to make use of this data and the capability and the skills to use that data to produce new results and to improve their food production practices. There are questions which in our community were asking at this point. About what in fact is the role of the nation state in this whole landscape. We say something quick about this, though of course it's a very big question. So it is clear that to some extent national interests are very important in propelling the travel of plant data and providing a motivation for sharing data or sometimes from withholding from data sharing. First of all, this whole space is very much inheriting a very heavy colonial heritage, where plants have long been seen as national resources, either to be salvaged from exploitation by other countries or in
Yeah, so I want to go over just a few of the main challenges to really addressing some of these issues surrounding plant data linkage and really making sure that that's both intelligent and responsive to a lot of different research needs and also responsive responsible and fair relative to some of the issues that Sabina's been talking about. So one of the first challenges really is that the whole landscape of data infrastructures is very difficult to understand just because there are many different databases with many links between them. And often those links are fundamental to how they work. yet it's not always clear what exists where or how they're connected to people who aren't necessarily working with that particular database. We found this in the mapping exercise that we've been doing to look at different infrastructures software and standards and from that perspective it takes quite a long time to try and understand, for example, the institutional links, funding sources, and specifically how different systems have
So yeah, what we are trying to focus on with our research is the idea that after seeing the ways in which people use databases on the ground, as Hugh was pointing to, we have seen that the most important way to engage stakeholders is to actually make them able to question and to constantly participate in how data stewardship is conducted, how data infrastructure are set up and how they're being used. So data infrastructure itself can do this, but trying to support and constantly ask its users for critical reflection on what constitutes best practice with data, who actually sets the models and the standards which are being inserted in databases and how they can be improved, whether these models and standards are actually realistic, whether they're empirically warranted, and what is the broader long-term vision and impact that is sought in these kinds of infrastructures. And for us, in fact, a key to try and think about the future is to think about the past and to try and record the past to these databases, what we're calling data history, in as much detail as possible in ways which are accessible to people, so that whenever users of these databases look for locations, methods, and interests characterizing each group that was involved in data processing, it's actually easy to access that and to use that information to evaluate how data could be then used going forward.
Thank you very much. If anyone
So
has any
in that
questions,
sense, the
if you want to
involvement
put
of